to the staff from Jefferson County Library.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome everyone. We are hoping that this time will be useful for you as we start going through the webinar and give you some starting points to think about how to provide library services at any time, no matter what the outside circumstances might be. Everyone presenting today are part of Jefferson County Public Library's Continuity of Operations team and worked on both the pandemic team and the gradual return to in-person services team. Steve brings expertise and experience in emergency operations and will be talking about the Continuity of Operations Plan, or as we'll be calling it from now on, the COOP plan. I'm Julianne, and I was the first pandemic officer utilizing the COOP plan and organizing our COVID response, and then led JCPL's response to the gradual return to in-person services. Lizzie served on both the pandemic team and the gradual return to in-person services team, and will be facilitating the breakout sessions that we have planned during the presentations, and has recently led our reconstitution team, which is how we unwind all the things that we did during the pandemic back to normal services. So just as a reminder that what our learning outcomes are for today, and to keep us all on the same page, whether it's a natural disaster, a pandemic, burst plumbing, or even a cyber attack, a COOP plan can help your library recover and provide services without interruption. So today we'll talk about why you might want to have a plan, what outside forces that might exist to activate your plan, and how a plan was used during the COVID-19 pandemic. So hopefully by the end of this session, we will have given you some tips and tricks and given you some ideas for what you might do next. And we have some time at the end for any questions, but please feel free to put comments or questions in the chat during the webinar, as we'll be monitoring that and responding as well there. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Julianne. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start us off by providing you with a brief overview of the planning process to familiarize those of you who've not worked with a COOP. Before we begin, I would like to preface this portion of the presentation by saying this is not intended to be the definitive answer to the COOP world. Instead, it's intended to provoke thought for helping you develop your own plan, or perhaps reassessing your existing plan. I'd like to begin with an outline of what I believe are some important pieces in developing a plan, and while there are a number of templates and services available, the basics remain essentially the same for all. You notice that this loop is iterative and that the goal of the loop is to lead to a successfully improved result. Now let's take a quick overview of the process. At the top of the loop, you'll see that there's a need to initiate the COOP planning process. While this seems obvious, what this really means is that the organization has decided it wants a COOP plan, and there's buy-in from the stakeholders and management hierarchy. Without that commitment, the plan's effectiveness will be compromised. Moving around, you'll notice clockwise the two hazards and risks. This piece should consider the feasibility of the hazard and rank them by probability and impact to your operations. What do I mean by feasibility? Well, let's use my organization as an example. We have a wildfire hazard in our plan because there's a good probability that could occur near one of our mountain libraries at some point. Having a plan for a tsunami, on the other hand, wouldn't make a lot of sense for us, but it may be a very real concern for those in coastal regions. To help frame the hazards and risks, what hazards and risks come into play, we'll look at some of the things we considered in our plan on a later slide. Moving around, next you should determine what your essential functions are. One way to look at this is to ask the question, what is it we have to do to meet our mission statement? Those required tasks and actions will become your essential functions. Now you can build the plan. As I said, there are Several useful examples and templates of COOP plans available that you can use to start to frame your plan. Some of them are very thorough and complicated, and others are pretty simple. My recommendation for you is to choose one that will work for you with the least amount of confusion and maintenance required. Moving around, the next step in the loop would be to train and exercise the plan. This is a really important piece of the process and shouldn't be bypassed. The organization that trains to and understands how their COOP works is much better prepared when a real emergency occurs. And of course, the last step in a loop is the maintenance and updating the plan. New buildings are built, facilities and operations change, new people come into the organization and others will leave. The plan needs to be maintained to reflect those changes. Now that we've identified the building blocks, let's drill down a little bit. So one of the first steps we had in the loop was to perform a hazard assessment. This examines the likely scenarios that could impact your business operations. As you can see from this slide, our plan identifies several events that could impact our operations. Of note is that not all scenarios have the same impact nor probability. Some of them could cause a very short delay in operations, such as a winter storm. As we've learned from the pandemic, some of them could impact our operations for years. This will be an important step in forming your plan and assessing the impact of those hazards and risks on continuing your operations in an off-normal environment. Now Lizzie will take us through a tabletop exercise to help you identify some of the risks and hazards that you may face in your system.
Thank you, Steve. So we have 3 exercises planned for this session. All of the worksheets that we are sharing are intended for you to be able to use and take back to your organization as you get started on working on a COOP plan for your team. So for this first exercise, we are focusing on hazards and risks. And that is going to be the first column in the worksheet. And Christine, we can pull that up. And if you look at your screen, so here's the example worksheet that we have displayed. And you should be able to download the worksheet in the toolbar on the left-hand column. So you'll see worksheet 1, participant worksheet. That is the blank worksheet that you can look at and will also be available to be downloaded later on the library's Learn website. So the examples that we've listed here are a wildfire, a tornado, a building fire, a network attack, cybersecurity, I think is an increased risk we're all looking at, a pandemic event. We had a gas leak come up as an example as well. So take some time and start thinking about what hazards and risks, just that first column, might be ones that you want to think about for your organization. And we do have the chat feature open, so you can chat with us if you have any questions that come up, or like clarification on anything, or if we can help. So let's take a few minutes and then we'll ask you to share some of those out as a group as you compile your list.
And as Lizzie mentioned, underneath where the presenters are listed, if you click on participant worksheet, you can actually download the PDF right now. It'll open a separate window and allow you to download it to your computer. They also will be available on Libraries Learn if you would like to do it later. But you can, if you're thinking about what hazards and risks you have, you can enter some of those we have a chat box on the lower left, or we have another chat box kind of to the right of the example. So just curious what hazards and risks you guys are working with. So one of our Jills, we have two Jills, which is kind of fun for today, has mentioned flood, pandemic, network attack, riot, and snowstorm. Yes, and I believe Jill was from outside of Colorado, but yeah, snow can be a big deal in Colorado as well. So that's an important one to remember. And the other Jill, flood, fire, snowstorm, pandemic. These are great.
These are really great. We've done this worksheet. We did this workshop at the Cal conference this year, and we had a participant share that a hazard that they have to think about is what happens when there's a moose out front of the building, and they might need to keep everybody inside until the moose moves on. And that wildlife, depending on where your location is, can definitely be something to plan for.
Yeah, I think floods are a big one, and it could be flood from natural disasters or floods from just pipes bursting and those kinds of things, which can happen to anyone.
Flash floods. These are all really great examples and definitely things you'll want to be thinking about as you develop a COOP plan. Any last questions or other thoughts to share out before we turn things back over to Steve? All right. Great. Well, thank you for your participation in that one, and we will get back to the presentation.
Thank you, Lizzie. So we're going to move forward to identification of essential functions. Now that you've assessed those hazards and risks, what do you do with that information? You want to determine what functions are necessary to continue your mission so that you can begin to formulate how the hazard would impact those. What you see on this slide is part of our essential functions list. In its development, there may be some basics to consider that aren't necessarily essential functions, but have to be in place for the essential function to continue. For example, we can't provide access to materials if the building the materials are housed in isn't safe. When you've identified the essential functions and how they could be impacted, your plan should rank your essential functions by priority. This is really important because it's unlikely that you'll immediately have all the resources you need to carry out all the tasks the plan identifies. Limited resources and personnel may limit your response capabilities in the first hours or even days. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lizzie one more time, and she's going to take us through another exercise to think about essential functions. Lizzie?
Thank you, Steve. All right, so we will use the same format that we used for the last exercise for this one, but this time we'll be looking at the worksheet to think about the essential functions for your organization and listing them down. And then also thinking about how to prioritize them. So you might want to prioritize them from 1 to 10 or however many that you have. So the examples that we have to kind of get your thinking started is providing building security, assuring that your facilities are safe to access. Are utilities available and functional? Is there a power outage or a water outage? And then again, that cybersecurity question around network security. So the worksheets are available in the same place for you to download right now. And we've got the chat open up again. So think about what your mission essential functions are and share some of your thoughts in the chat. We're always happy to answer questions. And Steve suggested we remember thinking about our mission statement, and that is a great place to stay grounded in which essential functions might be the highest priority for you.
And I think a lot of people probably did some of this work at the in March 2020, kind of thinking about what essential functions were and how to keep them going if your library happened to be closed to the public and those kinds of things.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And I think for many of us, our essential functions have shifted a little bit. For example, for our organization, we now look at airflow as an essential function before we think about building access. We really want to make sure we have that adequate airflow going before we provide access to the space. And that's for our staff safety as well as for the public safety. Um, so sometimes the essential function might shift a little bit based on what your hazard or risk that you're responding to.
So Jill was saying that she works for the outreach team and was hoping to build what she's been calling a resiliency plan, but she thinks that COOP makes a lot of sense, but it might not make sense for one department in isolation. When she thinks about outreach, essential functions are providing technology access to the community, providing, I can't say this word, continuity to the community, promoting library services and keeping employees safe, providing access to the library collections outside of the building. And I think, Jill, I don't know, you could maybe kind of start devising a COOP plan, and then kind of share that out, to the larger world. And the resources that will be available on Libraries Learn, you're welcome to share with others. They've been generously created by the Jefferson County staff, so feel free to share with the larger library organization as well.
Yeah, and Jill, in terms of your COOP plan, a lot of times the mission essential functions are the same system-wide, but how everybody actually provides those services in the mission essential functions can be different. We discovered that based on building design and also our own outreach service. What do you do with a bookmobile stop when we had to do social distancing and it was too small to let anybody come onto the vehicle? So starting to think about a COOP plan can help you provide your own department services, and it can also help start a conversation for your system as a whole.
Right, those are really great thoughts, and definitely things that I think over time you will always want to keep assessing and evaluating. So keep your questions coming in the chat if you have any more that come up, and we will get back to Steve's part of the presentation.
Thank you, Lizzie. So you've assessed the hazards and determined what your essential functions are. Now it's time to build a plan that will begin to outline how the organization is going to respond to a disaster or hazard so that it may continue to carry out its essential function. There are a number of ways to organize a COOP plan. This slide is a summary of how ours is organized. Now, before we go any further, one of the things I'd like you to take away from this, if you take nothing else away from what we're presenting, is the next three statements that I'm going to make. And those are, when working on the development of a plan, it should not try to cover every possible contingency. Instead, focus on developing a framework that allows for good decision making in the midst of a crisis. Remember to focus on how you'll maintain continuity of functions and not of particular people or positions. Those are really important statements. So sometimes the person most qualified to make a decision is not part of the current management hierarchy, which makes delegation and succession of the decision making very important. That's a good lead into our next slide. The reason for succession planning is that in a disaster or an emergency, the primary person responsible for a task or a team may not be able to respond, or worse yet, may be a part of the emergency. As you can see in our example, we've chosen to have 2 alternates for our facility relocation team. Now, your system may not be large enough to have that many alternates, and that's okay. But you'll want to have a process in place on how you'll make decisions if part of your decision-making team is not available. Another important list to have in your plan is the delegation of authority. As you can see, our plan considers who can close a building, who can sign emergency contracts, who has spending authority in emergency, and how much. This is a key piece in your planning efforts to determine who has the authority for what. While those roles may be defined and well defined in normal operations, in an emergency, those authorities become clouded. Having them spelled out up front allows the organization to respond with more surety and efficiency. And now I'd like to hand it back to Lizzie one more time to take us through the delegation of authority exercise.
Thank you, Steve. And this is our last exercise today. And this exercise is a worksheet where you can begin identifying those key roles. As Steve mentioned, when you consider roles, do think about who can close a building, who can sign emergency contracts, who has spending authority in an emergency, and for how much. This is a key piece in your planning efforts to determine who has the authority for what. So Christine will take us over to that last worksheet. So you can see in this example, we're thinking about the building access. And so we've got our facilities director and operations manager there. You might think of other situations, maybe who has authority to close a building in case of a gas leak. And in that case, you might want that to be, for us, I think that would be the person in charge of the building for that day, because there's that really immediate risk where in some other cases, we might have that authority move up the chain. So if there is a water outage, we might not ask that person in charge to be responsible for that decision and ask them to check in with our kind of system level person in charge for the day. So start thinking about what those different roles are for you and who might be responsible for that. And again, those worksheets are in the same place, and we have the chat open where we can answer questions and hear a little bit about your examples.
And just thinking about what Jill was talking about before, when you're talking about outreach, it's once again very possible that you might have kind of a bigger plan, but if it's something specific to outreach because of snow or something like that, you might have your own identified positions within your team that might make sense.
That's a great point. If you're driving around, the people doing the driving probably know the best what the conditions are and if it's safe to be out there. Yeah, Jill, it's a great thought. And, you could also, I think sometimes something I think about when we think about these roles and responsibilities is what level of that decision making, what is that responsibility? And is it one that the person who has the information might be comfortable making, or is that a bigger decision than they might want to make? Sometimes we have just a clear process where the decision maker might still be the director, but maybe you put in a process where the driver has a really clear line of communication or way to give that input and check in. So it depends on your organization itself. Yeah. That's a great question about remote work and where people are located. Really great ones to be asking of your organization and your team. All right, thank you, Jill. Any other questions or other thoughts on those roles and responsibilities we could chat about as a group? All right, back. So now we'll move on to Julianne's part. I was going to say back to Steve, but it's really back to Julianne. Thank you for your participation in that.
Yeah, thank you all. Those are great questions and points that are being brought up. So a COOP plan, as you've just heard, is really there to ensure that you can provide services when outside forces interrupt all aspects of society. Those interruptions can be the natural hazards such as fires and floods. The COOP plan that JCPL actually created and did, which was a framework that we filled things in on, had an appendix for a pandemic. And when we created the plan, we never thought that we would actually be using this appendix, but it was invaluable for us. We created the COOP plan in 2017, and at that time, the risk of the pandemic in the plan was actually identified as moderate. And like many organizations, once we created the plan, only a few people were involved in keeping it up to date. This pandemic appendix had been created to identify key information that the organization should know when confronted with an epidemic. It described how an organization might be affected and what measures could be taken to mitigate those effects. It created a framework for both short-term and long-term strategies for maintaining services during an epidemic and identified internal issues you might need to deal with, such as absenteeism among employees could be as high as 50%. And so now I'm going to take the next few minutes to share how we use this plan and what we did during the last 2 years at JCPL. The plan meant that we already knew who was on the pandemic team. The roles and responsibilities were identified before. The pandemic team actually started work on March 3rd, 2020, when the first case of COVID was identified in Colorado, and before any shutdown was planned for the library. During this time, the work of the team was to prepare for the expected things during a pandemic, such as the unavailability of staff, access to resources, changes to buildings, and possible public health orders. Unlike other disasters in which the period of disruption may last from a few weeks to a couple of months, a pandemic has the potential to disrupt operations from months to several years. We're all living the reality of that in this moment. The public health response to an epidemic will directly affect an organization, particularly when dealing with how you can provide services or how staff can work. This will require a strong relationship between public health and the leadership of the organization. We found this to be the most important part of the plan. Early on, the library created strong relationship with Jefferson County Public Health, which was invaluable in both understanding how the public health orders applied to the library and in clarifying the best practices to keep staff and the public as safe as possible. We had leadership from the library attend all the public health meetings. Even before the pandemic, we had library staff who served on the county's Emergency Operations Center whenever it was activated. And that person served in the Emergency Operations Center for the pandemic as well. The pandemic team started out as our executive team with the directors from each division, facilities, public services, human resources, and our IT department. We quickly realized to create something more flexible, we needed to create something more flexible. The executive team could not run both the pandemic response and the longer-term strategy response. We created a structure that had flexibility. The executive team set the strategy and priorities, while the pandemic team became an implementation team. We would create strike teams from all levels of staff to implement a specific task, such as identifying and finding PPE for staff so that they could come back into our buildings. Once this task was complete, the strike team was disbanded. Working in this way, we could have multiple strike teams working on specific tasks and utilize different staff for each strike team. This created a group that could expand or contract depending on the amount of work that was required. It also kept all our staff employed and paid while the buildings were closed. Throughout all of this, the first concern for JCPL was the health and safety of our residents and following current health guidelines. We had already defined our mission essential functions in the COOP plan. These remained the same no matter what the disaster was in creating the interruption of service. We also identified the resources needed to provide those functions in our plan, and the functions were divided into 3 tiers. The purpose of the tiers were to be able to prioritize what function had to occur without interruption, what functions could be suspended for a short time until resources or processes were in place, and what functions needed to be added if the interruption was longer. What we thought were essential functions, such as providing access to our buildings and materials, proved to be impossible in the first few weeks of the pandemic. So we actually reprioritized those services quickly. We moved resources and created processes to support these changed priorities, and making these changes were easier since we had already identified our essential functions. This is a list of the priorities for JCPL. It doesn't need to be complicated, as you saw in the breakout sessions. It can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. The original plan prioritized ensuring buildings were open for both the public and staff. We flipped this to prioritizing access to our digital resources, our call center, and creating virtual programs. Access to physical space was not allowed for the public, so we concentrated on creating access to materials through ways outside our buildings. Wi-Fi access became more important than computers. Before the pandemic, Wi-Fi was available outside our buildings, and during the pandemic, we boosted our signals and made sure the Wi-Fi could be accessed from personal devices anywhere in our parking lots. Within the first 4 weeks, we had ordered additional hotspots and began working with community partners to get them checked out to individuals and groups. We then looked at how to provide access to physical materials when people couldn't come into the building, with curbside and expanding our mail delivery services. The original plan actually had collecting and evaluating library statistics in Tier 3. You'll notice that we no longer have a Tier 3 in our priorities. We moved collecting stats and data up in the list because knowing how people were using our services was critical in deciding what services to provide or to change. Having the list of essential functions already created made it easier to make these adjustments. Every library and community is different, so it's important that you create your own set of priorities. A COOP response is really only meant to last about 90 days. But as we all know, more than 2 years later, we are still adjusting services based on the pandemic. We needed to transition to a more proactive response to in-person services. So in April 2020, Steve became the pandemic chief, and I began to lead the gradual return to in-person services team. This team was created to lead the longer-term strategic approach in providing in-person services during the pandemic. Both teams ran concurrently through July of 2020, and then the pandemic team began to stand down, and was actually disbanded by August of 2020. The strategy for the gradual return to in-person services team entailed the process of meeting the needs of JCPL staff and the community in a sustainable and safer way, and the steps necessary for residents to gain access to a full spectrum of resources and services, including physical books and materials, access to staff, access to technology, and space. The plan outlined a tiered approach providing services through the COVID-19 pandemic based on current public health orders. When the state of Colorado actually had a color-coded dashboard, we utilized that by identifying what services would be provided at each level. This allowed us to expand or contract the services offered based on what level the county was at. It also let staff know what to expect as we moved up and down the dial. We communicated this to staff, and they had access to the plan on our intranet. This relieved stress for them since they knew the type of service we would be providing based on what was happening in our community. The gradual return to in-person services was operationalized by September of 2021, and we now have a plan to provide access to library resources and services without interruption, while ensuring we are meeting all the requirements of the current public health orders. In the last 2 months, we created a reconstitution team, which led the library through normalizing our services and unwinding all the pandemic changes that were still in place. They were responsible for removing the plexiglass shields, the social distancing stickers on the floor, reopening our water fountains, and we expect this team is actually going to be finishing up their work in the next couple of months, and then they also will be disbanding. JCPL created new ways to work effectively and provide services remotely, digitally, and in person during these challenging and uncertain times. We collaborated to ensure the well-being of our staff and our community. We implemented evaluation and feedback processes to modify how we provided access to library resources. At the same time, we expanded or offered new services weekly. We regularly adjusted our plans in response to changing conditions and developed new approaches to meet current needs in our community, while always keeping the health and safety of our staff and community our first priority. Having a plan for a pandemic allowed us to stand up a response within a day of activating our COOP plan and provided a framework that allowed us to pivot quickly and meet the needs of a rapidly changing environment. The question isn't, will your organization at some point face a fire, flood, or some other disaster that may affect property, persons, or operations? The real question is, how are you going to respond to it, and so that you can mitigate the damage and continue to provide library services? Hopefully today we've offered some reasons for why you might want to have a COOP plan and offered some steps that you can utilize to start creating your own plan. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Excellent. I'm just fascinated by the fact that JCPL had a pandemic plan in place before the pandemic. And Jill is saying that this was exactly what she was looking for. So in just a second, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull up those slides. If you have questions, I just wanted to get to our survey and our the Libraries Learn website in just a moment. But if you guys do have any questions, pop them in the chat and we will make sure that the presenters address them. We do still have plenty of time in today's session. We do have a survey. If you would like to fill it out, you can click on the link in the center of the screen. I will also pop it into chat. You can click on it there. And then, so that you guys have access to the materials, the handouts, the worksheets, and in probably an hour, the archive, I wanted to post the Libraries Learn website in there so you can access that information. And once again, share it with other people at your organization. And Jill has a question that concerns employees, and she's going to try to explain it. So we'll see what her question ends up being. She was working for the Queens Public Library in New York when the pandemic began. Employees were very negatively affected, death, stress, child caretaking, etc. Yeah, not being able to use public transportation. And she's looking for a COOP plan that doesn't take advantage of employees, but she also doesn't want to create tiers of employees. Yeah, so like if employees who don't have kids would have to come in, etc. So she's wondering how you guys dealt with some of that.
Yeah, so Joe, we actually discovered there were a lot of positions, I will say myself included, who couldn't imagine doing their job remotely, that I would need to be in the office, and discovered that it could work. And what we're actually looking at now as one of our strategic priorities for 2022 is how do we create a hybrid work environment now that we have learned that obviously folks who work on the floor need to be on site, but there are other positions that can work from home. What does that look like? What is our expectation? Do we want a partiality of part remote and part on site for everybody? And so we actually have a team working on evaluating that and coming up with recommendations this year. So I will tell you that we, during the pandemic, looked at the position and the tasks. For instance, our call center became a hybrid and worked from home, and we gave them technology so they could answer phones from their computer and also be able to come in. So that way we could sort of give some options and ensure that everything was covered. And we actually have changed our bad weather policy. If we close the libraries for bad weather, folks who have the ability to work remotely no longer have a snow day. They continue to work.
Thanks for sharing that, Julianne. And Jill, I would encourage you not to think specifically about kind of those tiers that you're thinking about when you're developing your plan. So one thing that is really useful about the COOP is really focus on that decision making and then rely on the resources you have available in making the decision for the specific incidents. For example, I think like to Julianne's example about not knowing who would be able to be remote, who needed to go into the office, what that hybrid would look like. During this pandemic, we were able to rely pretty heavily on our partners in state and local government for some of those guidelines. For example, in Colorado, we had a type of leave that was available for someone who had, we had COVID leave available for someone who had a child whose childcare wasn't available or school had closed. And so we used some tools like that where we leveraged those specific leaves that were available to this situation to help navigate some of those things. But we didn't have policies where we were kind of course, we had some situations early on in the pandemic where we had a more voluntary coming on site where we were asking staff more than requiring. But then as we moved back into normal operations, we didn't really take those specific things into account. We really used that outside guidance and and information. And I think that decision making, then the people who are the decision makers have access to that and access to what's going on in your state and at your local level, and can make decisions based on the information they have available at the time.
And one other thing I'd like to throw in there for you, Jill, is job descriptions will help you categorize some of that simply by becoming essential employees. In the facilities world, we couldn't just walk away from our buildings and say, okay, we'll just close them up. But we still had to make sure the heat and the power was on and it was well maintained and protected the taxpayers' investment. So my employees in the facilities world were considered essential employees, and that's part of what they do. So they didn't really skip a beat through the pandemic, but that becomes a critical link in your COOP plan is how you're going to make that work, and the job descriptions will help you identify that to some degree.
Yeah, that was an excellent question, Jill, and I think it has a lot of layers, as you can hear from the presenters. Any other thoughts or questions today? All right. Well, I personally want to thank all of our presenters for sharing such great information, and I especially love the worksheets. I actually attended the session when they had it at our State Library Association conference this last fall. That was how I roped them into doing this session for me. I just liked that people could walk away with those tangibles. So once again, the Libraries Learn website is on the screen. It is in the chat. It will be part of the archive. All of the worksheets have already been uploaded, as well as the examples that they shared. So I will work on getting this archive available. It should be up within the next hour at librarieslearn.org. And once again, I want to thank the participants for attending today and for listening and asking great questions and adding your thoughts to the chat. And then once again, just my thanks to Julianne and Lizzie and Steve for agreeing to do this session with me. So I'm wishing everybody a great rest of your afternoon.